Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Welcome back to the DMZ, everybody. Springtime has sprung. Bill, it's starting to get nice, and I'm guessing
cherry
that
blossoms. Did the cherry blossoms survive the frost?
it's about 50-50. It's not the best cherry blossom year. It wasn't just the frost; it was the 6 inches of snow that fell after they bloomed. So if you go down to the tidal basin, it will not be as lovely as it normally is, but you'll still get some this week. It's pretty. About half of them survived, I would say. So,
And
but
as you know, Matt, the end of spring, so the beginning of spring is the end of sugar shack season here in western Massachusetts. So the taps are still flowing for maybe a week or so. So come up here, the little weekend jaunt with you and your partner. Get some fresh maple syrup. You know what? Not a bad way to spend the weekend.
I need to make it up there one of these days, Bill. You know what? People don't realize Bill and I have only hung out in person 3 or 4 times, right?
Yeah, well, and in DC, you've
It's always been in
my
DC.
direction.
Yeah, well, next time there's a big political conference in Northampton, I will definitely be at that one. No, actually, it would be awesome to go to it, as we've discussed before. Not only Sugar Shack season, but there's some history there, right? Calvin Coolidge, and who is the sort of revivalist preacher? Jonathan Edwards. So there's stuff to see there.
It's a conservative fun fest here in Northampton. I can show all the Calvin Coolidge sites. You know, we can even take a jaunt into Connecticut and go to Holy Land, USA.
There you go. Is that where they have the dinosaur museum, or is it?
I don't think
somewhere else.
I don't think so. I know there's an enormous cross. There's which you see.
Okay,
from Highway
well that's
84.
good enough for me. So anyway, it is getting nice here, but things are heating up in the political world. In fact, some say that they may have boiled over this week. So refresh my memory. Did we talk before or after? I guess we talked before the healthcare bill collapsed, right?
Right. We've not picked through the wreckage.
And I don't remember exactly where we were. Do you remember where we came down? Do we look stupid this week, or do we look wise?
I think both of us said repeatedly that this was a disaster in the making.
That's good. So it's good. I talked to. I noticed an interesting trend where there's a certain type of person, and I talked to different sources. You know, sources they're not just always leaking you info, but they're just sort of giving you like their take. And so I have a good source who's a Republican operative type, and he said, this bill will pass. This is on Friday morning. This bill will pass because this bill has to pass. Or whatever day, what day did this thing go down? Was it Friday or Thursday? Whatever day it crashed, he said, this bill will pass. And I'm like, well, are you sure? It feels like they're not going to come together. Oh no, it has to pass. And of course, it did not. So be careful listening to smart.
What I find interesting about that is,
sources.
I mean, obviously, it did not have to pass. This wasn't a must-pass situation. It's not like if you don't pass it, the government shuts down or the debt defaults and there's a global economic calamity. Even though there was a lot of talking points that, Obamacare is in a death spiral and there'll be no insurers in your state. That's not literally true. So you could not do it. It was a possible thing to not do and talk about the next day.
They did not do it. Yeah, no, I mean, he was saying from the Republican operative standpoint, this was like unthinkable that you would defy a president's first, the thing that they had promised the Republican. Philip Klein from the Washington Examiner called this the biggest broken promise in American history or American political history, something like that. So it was unthinkable, but for me, here's what it came down to. My source was sort of saying collectively they will have to pass it. This thing will pass because it has to pass. But I'm saying, like, okay, forget about collectively. Look at it individually. If you're like an individual congressman, what incentive do you have to conform and to buckle to leadership or to the president versus standing your ground and voting the way you want to? And so, to me, if you look at it at that level, at the individual level, it didn't look to me like it was going to pass, and that turned out to be right.
Well, I mean, you would have that obligation if the message in your district was, this is Obamacare repeal, and if you vote against it, you are voting against Obamacare repeal. And what Ryan and Trump bizarrely didn't grasp is, in all due respect, conservatives have a way of distorting and trashing almost anything that comes down the pike. So if you don't, I mean, they should be aware that you're dealing with at least a faction of people who are going to be hard to corral and really don't have any instinctual desire for anything resembling pragmatic compromise. So
I've said this before. Donald Trump is used to doing deals with people who have an incentive to do a deal. Even if people are making a deal in a weakened position, they still have an incentive to do a deal, usually. But members of Congress have incentives to not do things. So Trump's experience as a businessman in negotiating may be very different than negotiating with members of Congress who answer to their own constituencies, who have their own incentives, and in many cases their incentives are to squash deals and to not, back him.
So here's my question for you.
Yeah.
We've talked before about how your average Trump voter will quickly rationalize any flaws that manifest about Trump. That there's a bond there. They'll see him as fighting for me, being on my side, all that kind of thing, and they'll excuse a whole host of transgressions, at least to some point. Perhaps there's a breaking point somewhere down the line, but it's not probably not going to be quickly. It was a pretty main plank of his candidacy that you don't need a bunch of 10-point plans from me. You don't need to see a whole bunch of policy papers. Just know that I'm Mr. Art of the Deal. I know how to negotiate. I know how to get things done. It's going to be so easy. And here is the first instance where it's manifestly obvious that it's not so easy and negotiating a real estate deal. I mean, I heard him once say, hey, I negotiate a deal through the zoning process of the Upper East Side. I can handle Congress. Obviously, those two things are not analogous. Is there any twinge of concern in Trump Nation that, maybe he's not the greatest negotiator? Maybe this is not going to be so simple.
Not yet. I think that's the sort of thing that there's a cumulative effect. If this is just a harbinger of things to come, then eventually you could see people turn on him. But I think that, keep in mind, when you vote for somebody, you're investing in them. And so, it's even more the case if you wear the guy's hat or put up his yard sign. So those people who are true believers in Trump, they are invested in him. And it's in terms of their own image of themselves, they would have to admit that they made a mistake and that they were duped, right? Like, I thought Trump, I believed him, but I'm naive and I'm foolish for believing Trump. Therefore, I made a mistake. Nobody wants to have that. I mean, nobody wants to admit that they themselves were duped or made a mistake or miscalculated or whatever. And so I think that it takes a lot for someone's core supporters to abandon them. It takes more than just one example of even though the evidence is pretty compelling here.
Now, I believe we both wrote in separate pieces that this was the best choice available to them, pulling the plug on healthcare early and not getting stuck on it for months and months and months was the best course. It was a dead-end street. It's going to chew up the clock. You want to move on to other issues where you have a better shot, and therefore there's no point browbeating Trump and Ryan about it. But now there's sort of this complication where you have House Republicans saying, "Oh no, it's not dead. We're still talking. It could still happen." And senators saying, "Come on, let's move on to tax reform here." And you got Trump folks signaling, let's move up infrastructure. Let's get infrastructure on the table." Do you think that Republicans have figured out what the rest of the legislative calendar should be, or is it total disarray at this point?
Well, I think that the problem is that the Republican Party is overall still, like, just, there's a saying, like, in baseball or whatever, football, winning solves all the problems. You start winning and then everything just sort of works itself out. I don't think that's true in this case. I think there's, like, a lot of underlying problems in the Republican Party that were never worked out. And I think right now you still have this identity crisis, quite literally an identity crisis. Is this going to be a party that whose agenda reflects what Donald Trump ran on, which is like nationalism and populism, or is this going to be a party, a movement, a government that like outsources governing to Paul Ryan? And those things are very much at odds. I'm not saying that you can't find a way to combine the two, but I don't know yet what's going to happen there. I think that things are in flux. I mean, you tweeted out a Bloomberg article yesterday, Bill, that now there's talk that the tax reform may not happen until fall. I think that's about 6 months behind where they hoped it would be. So it's unclear what's going to happen. I think the big questions now, though, or not questions, but the sort of asterisks are, so there's going to be this big fight over the Supreme Court nominee Gorsuch. McConnell may go nuclear. And if he does that, I think two things happen. Number one, I think Republicans and conservatives will be appeased for a while because Gorsuch looks like a great pick, and it's a lifetime appointment. And so I think that buys Trump some time with the base, even in the wake of this healthcare plan collapse. I also think it probably poisons the well even more with Democrats, though. I mean, the notion that Trump might be able to triangulate, work with Democrats, get Democrats to support him on things, including infrastructure. I would just imagine that the nuclear option thing just complicates that even more. So. Yeah, this is really, it's going to be interesting to see if Trump can find his way out of this. He's facing a very daunting challenge.
There's a lot there that I want to dig into, but just to go back to what you said earlier, you've talked about how the Republicans didn't reconcile their ideological differences in the primary, and now they're stuck having to hash it out now. And I agree that there's a major tension between the economic nationalism of Trump, where they want to be more protectionist and they're comfortable with public spending on infrastructure, versus the more libertarian approach of a Paul Ryan. But that wasn't the tension that befell healthcare. I mean, Trump has largely been a pretty traditional conservative so far. He hasn't pushed his trade policies beyond rhetoric so far. He's generally just pursued deregulation, and repealing Obamacare is something that they all want to do. This strikes me as more of a tactical problem between Trump Ryan, which is, hey, look, there's rules and procedures here that make just straight repeal complicated, not to mention the political problem of just stripping healthcare out of people's hands. Let's try to do this in a delicate way.
Well, let me just jump in real quick, Bill. I think there's a real problem, which is so just from my own perspective, like whenever you're writing a column or writing a book or giving a speech. The real problem is, like, what is this about? Like, what is, like, getting to that, like, what is this column about? And quite often, as you know, Bill, there's a lot of fat that needs to be cut out, like, for it to work. And so I do think there's a problem of having an identity crisis where Donald Trump, his brand image and his core philosophy is not consistent with the actual legislative agenda Republicans are pushing. And I have to say, as a conservative, I am much more, as a conservative, I'm much more in line with probably the Freedom Caucus than I am with Donald Trump. But if I were a strategist advising Donald Trump, a purely Machiavellian sort of apolitical, sort of non-philosophical strategist, I think I would tell him, to thine own self be true. You have to find out what you believe and what you want your administration to be about and your agenda to be, and things have to fit under. No, I'm not saying it has to be completely narrow. It could be an umbrella of things. So, like in the case of Reagan, maybe it was, beat the communists and restore optimism in America and limited government or whatever. So everything has to fit under that umbrella. But it does feel like it's a little bit schizophrenic, and I just don't, I know this isn't a column, this is the American government, but I feel like that there's some discordance there, and I don't know if it can work. The American public did not elect Donald Trump in order to push a Matt Lewis, Paul Ryan, Marco Rubio agenda.
I mean, Trump was elected to kick the immigrants out and launch trade wars, essentially. I mean, they wouldn't use that phrase, but Trump was pretty adamant about pushing back on China and Mexico. Those were sort of the top two real things that drove the candidacy, and that's not what's leading the train in Congress. Paul Ryan has dictated the legislative schedule, not Trump. The two big things are health care and tax reform, which are two things that, Trump talked about cutting corporate taxes, so it's not like it's totally out of the blue.
I guess the question is, should Trump go rogue? I mean, should Trump triangulate? I mean, he's pushing an agenda that's not really his with Republicans. That was not a Donald Trump healthcare bill. I mean, and look, I believe in separation of powers. I would hope that Trump couldn't co-opt Ryan completely. So I don't know, but my column's about should he take a lesson from Bill Clinton, and I think that's something. I'm sure it's something that Steve Bannon is thinking about now.
Well, so we'll expand on that. We say learn from Bill Clinton. You wrote about this for the Daily Beast. What did Bill Clinton do that Trump should emulate?
Well, I guess first the differences are that Clinton didn't make this shift until after the midterms, after the Democrats lost the midterms in 1994. So Clinton gets off to a pretty bad start with things like, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Travelgate scandal, Hillary Care, and then Democrats, for the first time in 40 years, Democrats lose the House. The 1994 Republican Revolution happens,
and the Senate,
but it's the first time they had lost the Senate before, but it's the first time they had lost the House in 40 years. I believe that's true, Bill.
Right.
Yeah, I think Republicans had the Senate briefly in the 80s or something, but anyway, in the House it was the first time in decades, and so then Clinton brings in Dick Morris, and they decide to triangulate, and he co-opts a lot of the Republican ideas, and he's going to end welfare as we know it.
So he also had the standoff with Gingrich in the shutdown. So
that's true.
I mean, it wasn't just move right; it was triangulate. It was push off left and right.
Yep, and it seemed to work. Bill Clinton is reelected. He ends up, despite scandals, being pretty popular president, and he sort of did it his way. The first couple years felt like he was going to be this liberal, and then ultimately he segued into what I think is more his authentic persona, which is as a new Democrat and a more of a centrist. And the parallel that I see is that Donald Trump has also started by pushing his party's kind of base agenda, and I think that that's not his true self. And I think that just like the public was more with the new Democrat Bill Clinton, the American public may be more in line with the more populist Donald Trump. Now, questions arise, like, number one, how nimble is Donald Trump? I feel like before you say what you will about Bill Clinton, but in order to execute a shift like that, you have to come to terms. Earlier I was talking about how voters don't ever want to admit they were wrong, and I think politicians obviously have the same problem, because before you can pivot, you have to at least internally admit that you made a mistake, thus necessitating the pivot. I don't even know if Trump is capable of that, let alone whether this would work or not. But it's an interesting thing to ponder, because if he doesn't do it, it does feel like he's in a position now where, like, even though you and I agreed, Bill, that it was smart to sort of scuttle and walk away from this healthcare bill, it also does reveal a problem, which is to say that Democrats are reflexively opposing him. And so then if you can only rely on Republican votes, the Freedom Caucus basically has a veto, and the Tuesday Group basically has a veto. And so it does feel like Trump is in a trap.
Well, I think you're seeing more and more realization that you're going to need some Democratic votes for things. The whole plan for doing healthcare and tax reform was to do a back-to-back budget reconciliation, one for fiscal 2017 reconciliation, one for fiscal year 2018, to cover those two bills and circumvent the ability for Democrats to filibuster. Now you know that you can't even count on your own caucus to be unified, so you need Democratic votes one way or another. Therefore, that's starting to change people's calculations, what they can do. You're already seeing Republicans say, okay, we're not going to do the wall in the bill next month to keep the government open. We're not going to defund Planned Parenthood. That's not going to work. You're seeing the Trump folks say, let's move up infrastructure. Maybe we'll pair infrastructure with tax reform to try to pick off some Democratic votes. But my problem with that is that, so if you're a Democrat, now look, we've talked about Joe Manchin before. If you're Joe Manchin, you got to do what you got to do to get reelected. But I don't think there's enough Joe Manchins to help Donald Trump. I mean, isn't the message, if you're a Democrat now, that Donald Trump is weakened, so why would you help him? Why would you come to his aid and give him a victory? And that if you do support Donald Trump, you're aiding and abetting the enemy. Let's do the Republicans what they tried to do to Barack Obama, which is obstruct everything and don't give him any support. I don't know. Isn't the pressure from the base? Isn't the base pressure so heavy on Democrats right now that voting for even a good liberal bill that Donald Trump's behind would be considered apostasy? Well, there's clearly heavy pressure. I mean, I think what's happening with the Gorsuch nomination is a wake-up call to folks. Bill Nelson, pretty moderate Democrat in a swing state of Florida, but feeling possibly of some left-wing primary challenges over his shoulder, says he's going to filibuster Gorsuch. And that made it very clear that you have 11 Senate Democrats in states that Trump won, and another 9 in states that were pretty close. But clearly Republicans thought, hey, we can get 8 Democrats in the Trump states to stop filibusters, and now that's proving not to be the case. I mean, it's not a total done deal, but all the signals are that even McConnell is saying to his leadership, we're going to have to go nuclear here. Let's not, he said, feel no guilt about doing that. So if that's true on Gorsuch, that's going to be true on a number of things. Now, I wrote a piece for Politico that goes in another direction. When is it okay for Democrats to work with Trump? Because there's going to be things that are not so simple. I mean, by and large, Trump has been, clunky is to be charitable. He's done nothing to butter up Democrats and make it plausible, give them space to work with him in a good faith way. Very similar to how he's not really setting up Mexico to have a very warm and friendly negotiation over NAFTA, because all he knows is insults and badgering. So it makes it extremely difficult for Democrats to do that. But let's say you're already seeing Republicans make concessions on the government spending bill to avoid a shutdown. On the wall, I mean, it's not formal, but it looks like they're going to not do the wall and not do defunding Planned Parenthood. If it is just a straightforward, keep the government open, no deep cuts, maybe even no cuts at all, just sort of status quo bill, let's worry about a bigger bill 6 months from now. It's not, I don't think it's sound for Democrats to say, I'm not even going to give you a vote for status quo because we have to resist Trump. At some point, that's going to make Democrats look like the crassly political ones. You still have to have a reasonable case to make. If the argument is, you can't expect me to fund a border wall, people are going to get that. I don't think people are going to get, I'm not even helping keep the government open. Democrats want the government to be open. Democrats, they don't want shutdowns. They don't want debt defaults. Republicans could play that game with Obama because in their heart of hearts, they want the government to shut down. And some of them wanted to test the proposition that we don't need to pay off our debts. We want to force the issue and force deeper cuts. So I don't think Democrats have the same kind of tools in the arsenal. Having said that, I think the ability for Democrats to cooperate is pretty minimal, and to do something like infrastructure, if it's going to be a weak T infrastructure bill, that's a lot of tax cuts to corporations and not a lot of public spending, which Democrats believe won't create many infrastructure jobs, and you tie it to unrelated corporate tax cuts that say, hey, Democrats, pass the whole contraption. I don't think that's going to fly either. I mean, I think Democrats are going to grasp people don't like compromises for compromises' sake. You say you want bipartisanship, but most of the time compromises are hated by both sides and make everybody look bad. So if Democrats are going to vote for an infrastructure bill, it's got to be a pretty democratic infrastructure bill, unrelated to Republican tax reform, if that's going to fly. Because you can't go to an unemployed worker at your town hall and say, hey, I really want to give you that infrastructure job, but how to resist Trump. That's a tough message to sell. But you could say there's a whole host of awful things that no one was going to like, and the job creation was going to be pretty paltry. That's safe for Democrats to fight on.
Yeah, I just think Democrats could say, look, why should we vote to keep the government open if this is your president and you can't even get your members to vote for this? Why should we rescue you or bail you out? And maybe it's because
you look like a jerk saying that. That's I'm sorry that I've tanked the economy and and you can't get your passport and you can't get a park permit for your summer camping trip, but why should Trump expect me to help out? Democrats have to act like responsible, reasonable people. They want Republicans to look unreasonable, not themselves.
No, I agree with you, and I hope you're right, and I think that's smart politics. and also much better for America. But the base, the liberal base, I could see them. You know them better than I do, but I could see them making this argument, and it's not.
Well, I think there'll be a strain. There would be a strain that says, give them nothing, no quarter. They did it to us, and it worked for them. So stiffen your spine and just completely resist on everything. There's definitely going to be a faction that says that. I don't think the entirety of the Democratic base would say that. I think there are a lot of and the phrase is goo-goo, goo-goo Democrats who want to be, good upstanding citizens. Having just flat-out pro-shutdown messaging is going to make them uncomfortable. And I think Democrats will have space to do the minimum, so long as it's not being tied to poison pills. I mean, if there's poison pills, then you got a problem.
Right.
And maybe there's some proposal out there where the carrot is just good enough and the stick is just bad enough to make that decision really difficult. I don't know if Trump and Ryan have the savvy to figure out that sweet spot or bittersweet spot to make Democrats squeamish about what to do. But if the shutdown, if the government spending bill is just sort of straightforward, keep the government open, not kick anybody in the teeth, I don't think Democrats can easily sit on their hands on that.
So I guess part of my, interesting take now is that part of the reason, one of the many reasons I didn't support Trump in the primary is I suspect that he has these liberal tendencies, and couldn't be trusted as a conservative. And I think that I was onto something clearly. But now I'm at this weird point where I'm thinking the logical thing for him to do is to betray conservatives now and to try to get Democrats on board, and to sort of to triangulate. And so it's a weird thing. And the other thing too, Bill, I think we've talked about this before, but there was going to be a fight between the Rubio Ryan world and the Cruz Freedom Caucus world. They were going to have a fight, and one of them probably was going to emerge, and maybe there would have been some resolution there. But because Trump came in, God bless you, and upended that process, that fight, that resolution never happened. So even though Republicans have everything, and I think about to get a Supreme Court pick, which it's hard to sneeze at that. I mean, this is a lifetime appointment. But nevertheless, they were kind of deprived of this denouement that they needed to have and resolution. And I think that that's part of what the problem is now, is that the party still, it's not clear what it stands for, and you have this this discordance between what Trump ran on and the way that Trump has governed so far. Well,
you haven't seen Trump betray conservatives yet. I mean, obviously infrastructure makes him a little squeamish.
Yeah.
But some Republicans like Jim Inhofe, who are very conservative, are totally cool with infrastructure. So I wouldn't think that is a psychic break that I don't think it would cause a deep wedge.
I guess what I'm saying is that I'm torn because philosophically, I wish that I would have liked to have seen a real conservative get elected president and win the argument with the American public and have a mandate and an agenda, a governing agenda, and do some of these things, including picking somebody like Neil Gorsuch. Having said that, if I'm advising Donald Trump today from a purely Machiavellian standpoint on what he ought to do going forward, I think I tell him, to thine own self be true. Like, you do not push someone else's bill that does not represent your core brand image. And those things are at odds a little bit. Maybe this is like a little
there was a
therapy
debate
session for me.
There was a debate in the Obama White House after, I think it was after the healthcare fight, which they got done, but left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. It was very hard fought by hook and by crook, and even folks on the left didn't cheer it completely because it didn't have the public option. And there was a whole lot of horse trading involved. There was the whole Cornhusker kickback thing, which didn't look good, even though it didn't stay in there. And there was a faction of the White House team, I think led by David Axelrod, that said, if Obama is getting dragged into the muck of Congress, then he's losing his brand. He's losing his sheen. If you're just sort of part of the sausage making, you're not above the fray anymore. There was another faction, I think led by Phil Scher, if I remember correctly, who was a longtime congressional staffer who was the main liaison on the Obama White House, saying, "Look, you got to pass stuff. This is how it works. So I don't care how it looks. We're here to do things. We're not just here to just maintain fluffy approval ratings." So I think Trump is now a little caught in that, because the more he gets everyone thought he was going to charm Congress to the hilt, and the more he gland handles Congress and loses, that diminishes his brand. But I think unlike Obama, I don't think his agenda requires a lot of legislation. I mean, he's not an ideologue. He is happier fighting than problem solving. So he can do a lot of stuff through executive order. It might not stick, may get struck down by courts, but I don't think he really cares. And so if I was him, I would say, do the minimum in Congress, work with Democrats to keep status quo humming along, and then pick your fights at the executive level. And if you win, you win, you lose, and you shift the blame like you're always doing, call it a day. Now, there's one. I don't know if he's going to think that way. I mean, they seem to be thinking a lot about legislation still too. And one prospect that I floated in my Politico piece was, as much as compromising and working with Trump is distasteful for Democrats, if they could seduce Trump into breaking a major promise, well, that's gold. I mean, that's what Democrats effectively did with George H.W. Bush in 1990, when this is when Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. They had to pass a budget. Deficits were on the upswing after Reagan, and Democrats said, "Look, we got to cut the deficit, and we got to raise taxes to do it. And Bush, you're not going to get anywhere unless you accept that." And even though Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," he acquiesced. He could head count. He wasn't into having shutdown dramas, and he said, "Fine, we'll have to raise some taxes with this," along with some other conservative things. And they struck that deal. It did help contain the deficit, but it also permanently damaged Bush's standing with conservatives, which dragged him down in the primary versus Pat Buchanan and hurt him in the general election, helping him lose votes to Ross Perot. So if Trump gets really desperate, I mean, I'm not certainly assuming this is going to happen, but doesn't it for if you're a Democrat to say, "Hey, we can talk to you, but you got to restore the Clean Power Plan, or you have to give up the border wall, you have to give up on cracking down immigration, refugees from Muslim majority countries." We got to see how desperate Trump gets. But I think if he did something like that, thinking, "I'm Trump, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and people are still going to support me, I can get away with this," then I think Democrats would have really done a kill shot.
The thing is, we've had the last two presidents. I think the American public tried to send a message when they elected Barack Obama, and you'll disagree with me on this part, so I'll make this point under protest. But I believe Obama missed an opportunity to transcend partisan politics, and to really, he could have destroyed the Republican Party, and instead I think he became, by pushing healthcare, a liberal Democrat. and he sort of ran up the score and tried to. So he fell into the tribalism that exists. You got to pick a team. And he was elected as a liberal Democrat. He might have run as a new type of politician, but when push comes to shove, he was a politician. And I think that was a choice he made, but it didn't meet the expectations, the hopes of the American public about hope and change.
Well,
and then you have Donald Trump. Let me just I'll criticize my team ostensibly, which is I think Donald Trump had some of the same thing going. And of course, the first thing he does is do exactly what Republicans and conservatives, would have wanted them to do. And I do feel like, there is an opportunity for one of these guys to go rogue and to upset the apple cart and to have what's the movie I'm thinking of here, Bill? I can't think of it now. The guy who played Dick Tracy,
Warren Beatty.
The guy who played Warren Beatty.
Oh, Bulworth.
Yeah, what was his political movie?
Bulworth.
Bulworth. To have a Bulworth moment, and maybe that's like naive, but I think that why wouldn't Trump do that? He takes chances all the time. He gambles all the time, and he thinks that he can do anything and people will stay with him. Why wouldn't he do that?
I'm mildly flummoxed that he didn't go, post-partisan from the get-go, pick off more Democrats for his cabinet, lead with infrastructure. I assume, Pence has really surrounded him with a lot of conservative advice, and he's very influenced by, who's around him. That's
the weird thing is, I was afraid Obama was going to do that. I think the biggest fear, whenever you're doing something, you should always think what does my opponent want me to do, and I'm going to do the opposite. And yet these guys don't do that. I think the biggest danger for conservatives would have been if Obama really became what he ran on, and it had run a third way. And he would have transcended politics and potentially been this historic, figure, and then instead he became a Democratic politician. And I think Trump sort of has made the same bet now. It seems like he could always change, though.
I disagree with the Obama analysis. I think Obama wanted to be that guy. And let's. I mean, there are things that people tend to forget, but. He did reach out to Republicans with the Recovery Act. He did have a lot of tax cuts in there, but he only could pick off a few very moderate Republicans for him, although he did win to support the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So there was an attempt to build a hybrid coalition around that. In the healthcare debate, he had an olive branch to Mitch McConnell, say, if you guys want to talk about tort reform and limiting medical malpractice damages, let's talk about it. I think he won a 70-vote healthcare bill, not a 59-vote bill. But McConnell didn't want.
But I think tackling healthcare was the fundamental problem. I mean, that was going to be inevitable. It's like I say, it's a land war in Asia. I mean, it was going to inherently be not only messy but divisive. It was inherently divisive because look at the history of it. Look back at Hillary Care. I mean, this was something that Republicans had put a stake in the ground, and talked about socialized medicine, all that stuff. He should have known that was an issue. That was a no-go zone.
Well, I think he assumed, hey, I'm adapting ideas from the insurance industry. I'm adapting ideas from the pharmaceutical industry. I'm reaching out on tort reform. I'm going to prove I can tackle this long-standing thorny problem in a post-partisan way. And he learned the hard way.
But it was a long-standing problem that the left and the Democratic Party had been pushing for 50 years. It was not necessarily the most pressing problem facing America at the time.
Well,
that's he should have come in and said, look, I just think he should have come in and said, look, our biggest problem is the country's torn apart. People don't trust institutions right now. People don't like each other. People don't have faith in government. Let's work on that. Like, let's fix that instead of let's find a new problem to stir up trouble and to create acrimony and animosity and divisiveness in the country. And that's kind of what he did. That's what you do if you want to put points on the board for your team. I think what America really needed at that moment was a healer, someone to bring us together.
Well, again, I agree with you that in effect, that's what happened. I disagree that Obama's thinking going into it was this is going to make me a divisive Democratic Paul. I think he was very convinced that he was transcending politics, and in his mind, and a lot of advisors told him not to do it for the reasons you said, that it was a politically dangerous thing that it always has been. His approach was, this is an urgent problem. There are tens of millions of people who don't have health insurance. It does affect people's lives. And I'm going to problem solve a pressing problem in a post-partisan way. Obviously, it's not how it ended up. But I don't think he went into it thinking, I'm just going to put a point on the board for the left flank. So because of that, he learned soon enough that he wasn't going to get a lot of Republican cooperation. But even then, you still had, after Republicans took the House, you still had the grand bargain talks. You still had the fallback that was a bipartisan bill called the sequester and the super committee, which no one takes credit for, but it happened. And it did result in actual deficit reduction. So it's not like he never gave up on talking with Republicans, but the thing what happened with...
No, I think, look, I mean, every American president has had some bipartisan support or some negotiations and trade-offs. And I give President Obama credit, I mean, for that. Obviously, there were times when he worked across the aisle. What I'm saying is that I think he had a chance to be fundamentally a different, that he could have been a paradigm-shifting president. And he instead became... You know where I'm going with this.
Well, just to tie this off, because we should probably wrap up. Can you actually specify a particular piece of legislation that would have been truly a post-partisan opportunity for Obama, and does that exist for Trump today?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously, my bias would be something that benefits my philosophy, right? And that's not necessarily the right thing to do either. I mean, if you're trying to build those bridges, you could argue that saving entitlements is bipartisan because it's preserving entitlements, but I don't know if it would have been perceived that way. I just think so. The short answer is no. But this maybe could. I mean, I could write a column about it, but I don't know if anybody would read it. It's like. It's not timely. You know, it's like what Obama should have done 10 years ago. I feel like we could come up, if we put our heads together, we could come up with something. But my main point is, I believe that in 2009, and maybe even today, the pressing problem was that America seems like it's coming apart and that people don't trust the institutions. And that we're coming unglued, and getting involved in a land war, getting involved in something that was going to be inherently divisive is not the way to heal that. I would have prioritized that. I know it sounds like a touchy-feely sort of thing to say, that that's the number one problem, but I actually truly believe that it was true. And I think that's why I think that Trump, if I were advising Trump, I may tell him that, you know, if he were to try to transcend politics, the left versus right divide, and triangulate, that he could become incredibly popular in America. In a way, I hope he doesn't do it, because I'm concerned about his authoritarian tendencies. And so, like, if he becomes incredibly popular, that increases the odds that he just Well, let's not even get into that.
So I'm going to bring back the manometer now.
So don't listen to this.
Are we down? Are we back down to Trump as Nixon on the manometer at the moment?
Nixon. Where are we? I think. So I don't know if this is on the manometer, but wasn't there a time when Bill Clinton said that the president is still relevant?
Yeah.
I think that's where we're at.
So Trump is Bill Clinton. Trump is Bill Clinton circa '94.
I think he is this week. Yeah, that's where I'd put him on the manometer, if such a thing existed. I don't believe in the existence of it. So anyway, I feel like this was maybe a disjointed, weird episode, but that's okay. We have to hash out. I'm as you can see, I'm like hashing out my thoughts about this whole thing in the wake of this. Some might say historic collapse of the healthcare bill.
This will be in the history books as the worst first 100 days of any president, as many have commented, short of William Henry Harrison, who died on day 32.
Yeah, it's hard to beat that one. Although, again, Trump is doing some good stuff, including a big Supreme Court.
Well, let's see that. The one thing that I saw today that's got my attention was, so the assumption is Gorsuch doesn't have 60, but McConnell will go nuclear. He can't. People assume he can't lose 3 Republicans if he's going to go nuclear. But Senator Johnny Isakson is not in D.C. He's recovering from back surgery, and there's some question whether he can get back to Washington in time. So if he doesn't get back to Washington, then Republicans can't lose 2. Now, no one has said they won't, that they'll undercut McConnell on that, but Susan Collins, McCain, Jeff Flake, Lisa Murkowski, Lamar Alexander, Dean Heller's in a blue state, Cory Gardner's in a blue state. You got a bunch of guys that might want to be institutionalists and say, yeah, I don't know if I want to nuke the filibuster here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate that argument. I just feel like, because number one, Gorsuch is such a qualified and competent nominee, and number two, because Harry Reid already got rid of this for other executive appointments, that it's really hard for a Republican to take that stand now. But who knows? As you said, it could only take a couple.
I lean towards that they will nuke. But I think you have to be a little careful, not assume that they have the votes for it yet, because there's definitely some Republican senators that have been a little coy, and so we just don't know.
That's why people have to stay tuned to this program. Follow us on Twitter at DMZ Show. You can download this podcast. Just search for Blogging Heads in iTunes, and read Bill's column in Politico magazine, right?
Yep. When is it okay for Democrats to work with Trump? Also, my Real Clear Politics column this week. Meet the man who really owns Obamacare, Tom Price.
That's right. And my piece is in the Daily Beast, and it's called "Trump Needs to Reinvent Himself, a la Bill Clinton." Check that out. Enjoy Sugar Shack season, the waning days of it, Bill.
Thank you. And get your cherry blossoms while you can.
You get on some Nasonex, and we'll meet back here, right back here in the DMZ next week. Thanks, Bill.
Take care.